Shalom to everyone from Jerusalem, and thank you for joining us for the last of our three-part series, A Tour of the Yad Vashem Grounds. My name is Malki Weisberg, and I am responsible for the visits and the ceremonies of the international relations of Yad Vashem. I was extremely honored to be asked by Mr. Jeremy Weiss, the director of our American desk, to open the tour today. As the pandemic continues to cause travel restrictions and you cannot physically join us on the mountain, we are bringing the mountain to you virtually. We are all praying for the world to recover and for all of us to be able here in Yad Vashem to greet you in person. This very special series is dedicated to the memory of Adelson, patron of the Mount of Remembrance. His dear wife, Miri, have been great supporters of Yad Vashem since the early 90s. Sheldon grew up in Boston, a son of immigrants, and following his service in the US Army, he entered the business world, working as a mortgage broker, investment advisor, and financial consultant. Dr. Miriam Adelson was born and raised in Israel. Her parents, Menucha and Simcha Farbstein, left Poland before the war, but they lost many family members in the Holocaust. Sheldon sadly passed away on January 11th, 2021 in California at the age of 87. I feel so fortunate to have met him at the World Holocaust Forum last year, where the Adelsons honored us with their presence. We dedicate this series to Sheldon's memory, the memory of a proud Jew, a proud American, and as someone who loved Israel with all his heart. Due to the generosity of Sheldon of blessed memory and Dr. Miriam Adelson, our campus and educational programs have grown and developed. The Adelsons' dedication to the Jewish concept of Zachor, remember, certainly comes to fruition in Yad Vashem's many activities. Today we have a wonderful guide for your tour. Hailey Sharon-Dilman grew up in Toronto and made Aliyah in 2010. Hailey began in Yad Vashem as a guide for overseas groups and young leadership groups. She is currently the coordinator for educational content in the International School for Holocaust Studies. Today, Hailey will guide Yad Vashem's grounds with a specific focus on moral and ethical dilemmas surrounding rescue during the Holocaust. She will examine two different types of rescue, of righteous among the nations and family partisan groups, and I'll let her explain those to you. On behalf of Yad Vashem, I would like to wish you all a very meaningful tour today. If you have any questions, please put them on the chat and we'll be happy to deal with them at the end of the lecture and tour. Thank you so much. Have a meaningful tour.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction. So we're going to be talking today about rescue. And so before we can even get into the campus and begin our tour, the first question that we have to ask is, what does rescue mean during the time of the Holocaust? So I'd like to start with Dan Michman's definition. Dan Michman is the head of the International Institute of Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem. And he says that rescue was the act of rescuing Jews from the immediate danger of Nazis and their collaborators, or completely rescuing them from the regions of Nazi occupation. And he specifically points out summer of 1941 as the key time to understand when rescue could take place. But why summer of 1941? The summer of 1941 is the time in which the Nazis began the war against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, known as Operation Barbarossa. And this is also the exact same time that we begin to see the beginning of mass murder against the Jews. And so when we see the beginning of mass murder, we also understand a certainty of death that can begin to be understood by Jews and those people around them. And only when we have certainty of death, the argument goes, can we really rescue somebody? Now, of course, I would like to challenge this and bring this a little bit kind of up for debate by asking more questions to this definition. First of all, does it open a Pandora's box by saying immediate danger? Because how do we define immediate danger? For example, would it be to rescue somebody if we gave them a piece of bread in the ghetto when they were incredibly hungry, and perhaps that one piece of bread allowed them to survive an extra day, or a bowl of soup, or whatever it is? And so how much can we define that idea of immediate danger? And what about taking Jews out of Nazi Germany before 1941? Many people are familiar with the Kindertransports. These were Jews that were taken out of Germany before 1941 and brought to places in the UK. And so is that considered rescue, by taking those children out and then not having them go through the rest of the Holocaust? And what about something as simple as saving your brother or sister, or your wife or your husband? Can we consider that rescue as well? And so we have this kind of big definition, but at the same time, we can ask all these small little questions to open up that definition. And I'm trying to kind of set a picture here of how complicated these definitions can get, and how things cannot be looked at in a black and white way, that we have to look at this grayness or this multicolored idea in order to understand some of these deeper concepts. And in order to explore this even further, today I'm going to look at two specific groups, as Malki already mentioned. The first is what Yad Vashem gives the honor of as righteous amongst the nation, and the second is the family partisan camps. And so let's go into Yad Vashem's campus, where we're going to be able to talk about the righteous through the avenue of the righteous. So here we are. You guys can all see that we've arrived virtually at Yad Vashem's campus, and we find ourselves right after the main visitor center, which is just behind us. And as we come out of that main visitor center, we see a path directly in front of us, as you can see. And over to your left, as we move back, you'll see the entrance to the historical museum. And I like to always start my tours here, because we have just come to Yad Vashem, and we have a choice of where we can go. If we turn left over into this entrance, we go into the historical museum. And this, of course, tells the story of what happened to 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. And the path on the right, however, tells a very different story. This tells the story of those people, righteous amongst the nations, who helped save Jews by risking their own life. Today, there are approximately 27,712 righteous amongst the nation and over 100,000 rescue stories. And this is what we know of. And you can just imagine all of those stories that we actually don't know about. And so we stand here at the beginning, almost with ourselves with the choice, reminded of the moral and ethical choices that people took also at that time, of which path they wanted to take during history. I want to talk a little bit about righteous in general before we kind of get in specifically to the stories. In 1953, Yad Vashem was formally created by a law. And this paid tribute, not only was Yad Vashem established, but it also paid tribute to what they called the righteous amongst the nation. And they defined this as non-Jews who risk their own life to save Jews. And in this sense, they were given a special status because they shared the victim's fate and therefore had to be honored. But even though this was established in 1953, the program took a lot of time to grow. In 1955, it was suggested that trees be planted at the Yad Vashem campus in order to honor these people. But it really took until basically the early 1960s for this avenue of righteous that you can see on your right over here to officially be established. And a lot of this was created by the hype around the Eichmann trial. When Adolf Eichmann was tried in Israel, a lot of survivor stories began to come out, a lot of personal stories began to come out, and survivors began the push for recognition. They wrote letters to the Israeli government and to newspapers talking about the need for their rescuers to be honored. And we can understand why, as personal stories began to come out and atrocities began to come out, while at the same time, so did those stories of those people who helped survive. and help some people survive. And so they push the recognitions to come forward. In 1962, we begin to see the first trees planted at Yad Vashem to honor these righteous. And it was also in 1962 that we know that Oskar Schindler's tree was planted. However, even though Oskar Schindler's tree was planted in 1962, he was not actually nominated as a righteous until 1933. And we're going to keep that on hold as we get a little bit deeper into the story of Oskar Schindler. What also prompted the nomination of Oskar Schindler was a committee that was created in 1963 to look at each case of nominations. So let's talk about this a little bit more as we talk about Oskar Schindler himself. So I'm just going to come into the next video. So here we are, we're going to actually go into the actual Avenue of the Righteous, as you can see in front of me. And let me just talk a little bit about Oskar Schindler. When we get to his tree, I'll point it out. Oskar Schindler is probably one of the most well-known or recognized righteous because of Steven Spielberg's movie, 1993 movie, Schindler's List. And so we can see his tree right over here. Right behind this rock over here, you can see a tree that splits into two. And I'm just going to do a little bit of a zoom in here. And here's the plaque right in front of that tree that honors Oskar and his wife, Emily Schindler. So Oskar Schindler was born in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and he was considered by the Nazi racial profile as ethnically German, even though he lived in Czechoslovakia. He became, as he grew up, a savvy businessman, and he takes advantage of his status as being seen as German in order to use Nazi policies. And so he's going to join the Nazi Studenten Party. That's the first thing he's going to do. And in 1939, after the occupation of Poland by Nazi Germany, he's going to move to Krakow. He's going to move to occupied Poland. And once again, he's going to take advantage of his status by taking over two factories who had previously belonged to Jews. And then on top of that, he'll take advantage of Jewish labor by hiring Jews in his factory. And so if we have to ask ourselves at this point, what is Schindler's bottom line, or what is his goal? And it's a financial one. It's to make profits from the situation. And as this businessman, he was also known as an alcoholic and as a womanizer and as a socialite. He takes advantage fully of the situation, of the occupation and everything around him, and he makes money. And so before we can continue to talk about his story, I think that there's an important moral question here. I'm going to let the tour kind of play out just so that you guys can all get a sense of the avenue as I continue talking about Schindler. Does Schindler, even in the early stages, how do we see him in terms of being morally responsible? First of all, as a profiteer, or can we see him as just somebody who's a victim of the system, in the sense that he was just a simple businessman and that people higher above him created the circumstances that he took advantage of? And I think that this is kind of this kind of balance between the two, that, you know, he took advantage of the system, and he was this kind of, you know, horrible profiteer, versus him just being a businessman who went about his business. And I think that this question is very important because I mentioned that it was in 1963, after his tree was planted, that a committee was created in Yad Vashem to look at each case. And this committee sat on by judges as well as people who work at Yad Vashem. One of the kind of goals of this was to weigh each case and to make the most fair of decisions that they could. So let's come back to Oskar Schindler's story, because in the fall of 1943, we begin to see things changing. We know that in March 1943, the ghetto is liquidated in Krakow. And it's at this point that we see a difference in Schindler's activities. He begins to actively devote himself to protecting Jews in his factory, which is near Plaszow, the concentration camp just outside of Krakow. And through bribery, using his personal profits he made off of this factory, he begins to bribe officials to protect the approximately 1,000 Jews inside of his factory. And at this point, therefore, we see both a personal risk by putting himself on the line, and second, a financial loss in which he took in order to save and protect those Jews. By October 1944, the factory is no longer in use. And as the Nazis began to clear out ghettos and concentration camps in the east to move them westward, Schindler gets permission to move his factory to the Sudetenland in order to create armaments for the German army. And he's able to get permission to bring those Jews that were working in his factory to the Sudetenland, to Czechoslovakia. And in doing this, we know that he creates this famous list, Schindler's List, which is of course the basis for the movie about him. In the end, approximately 1,100 Jews are saved because of Oskar Schindler. So of course, I think the question here is, why wasn't he automatically honored? Right? In 1962, the tree is put, but 1993, he's honored. So why does it take so long for him to get this honor, this title of righteous amongst the nation? Well, when the actual nomination came out and he was about to be honored, and when the tree was planted, there were Jews who stepped forward complaining specifically about Schindler. And they said he was a Nazi party member. He was actually a spy for the Nazis as well before that. He robbed Jews when he arrived in Krakow. He utilized Jewish labor for his own profits. And if we're taking all of these years before, well, how do we know that from 1943 on, that actually maybe he was just using this as an alibi for himself, right? What gives us proof if we're kind of balancing out all these ideas? And so I think the moral question that we can ask here is, was Schindler a transformational leader? Well, I said that in 1993, he was nominated. And so according to the committee, yes, he was a person who transformed. Despite the morally compromised decisions he made before, they saw a man who had grown, who had displayed courage, kindness, and morality in saving Jews. And we especially know from testimonies from Jews who were saved by him that when the factory was moved out of Poland, that him and his wife, Emily, ensured that they had enough food, that they had medical supplies, and they cared for these Jews more than just moving them from place to place. And so there was growth here. And so this kind of dilemma that I was talking about before is he a businessman or is he profiting? It doesn't matter, because he grew as a person, and therefore the moral choice in which he made is sitting on the right side. I want to continue with our tour as we look at our next kind of figure, which is going to be Andrei and Magen Trocmé. So we're coming back into the avenue, and we're actually going to look at some of the first trees that we have at Yad Vashem. And Andrei Trocmé was a Protestant pastor in the village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon in France. And this is a story of a spiritual leader of a community, of a village in France. And here we have the tree for him that you can see right in front of you, who made the decision for himself, as well as the members of his community, by encouraging them to, first of all, help hide Jews. Second of all, help Jews escape to Switzerland through the border. And three, even if they didn't do either of these, he encouraged them not to reveal any of the information and any of the activities to the Vichy authorities in order to protect the village. And this is exactly what happened. So we can come a little bit closer and we can see the plaque. So here we have the plaque for Andrei and Magen Trocmé. So what I wanted to say is that Andrei Trocmé is known for a famous saying, which is, "These people came here for help and for shelter. I am their shepherd. A shepherd does not forsake his flock. I do not know what a Jew is. I know only human beings." And so with this kind of famous quote, he was able to inspire and encourage this village to save approximately 5,000 Jews. And those are people who were both saved inside the village itself, as well as Jews who were smuggled across the border. So I think that for me, one of the most important moral and ethical questions we can ask is, what is the role of a leader? Because Andrei Trocmé is the spiritual, and in many ways, the importance of his role as a spiritual leader is also a leader of the community in general. What is his role, and to whom does he have responsibility for? Because he risked his life by these activities, as well as the life of every single person in his village. Now, one of the conditions for becoming a righteous is danger and a risk to your own life. And this is exactly the dilemma that you have in Chambon-sur-Lignon, because by encouraging his congregation and this village to save Jews, he's asking them to risk their own life. And so what is the role of a leader? Today, in 2021, we know retrospectively that this was the morally right answer. Trocmé himself was arrested, and for 5 months he was put in a jail in Vichy, France, but he was released after 5 months because they had no evidence, because no one was able to say anything. He went into the underground afterwards because he was fearful of being seen and captured again. But his voice and his encouragement still allowed those people in his village to continue his actions. And so in that sense, he was still responsible for everything that happened. So in 2021, we can look back and say this was a great ethical and moral decision. But what happened if something else had happened? What happened if the entire village or large numbers of people had been murdered because they had been found out? What if one person had revealed the actions, the Jews had been taken, the Jews had been murdered, and all of those villagers had been murdered as well? So then in that sense, how would we judge his actions morally as a leader if the second scenario had happened? He had famously said as well that to do the will of, he told his congregations to do the will of God and not of men. And in this sense, he made an ethical choice and a moral decision to trust in God and his religion and follow his conscience despite the real risks he made towards his village and his congregants. Let's go back into our tour as we come to the next tree I want to look at. So the next tree that we're going to look at is going to be more in the east. We're going to leave France and come more eastward to Latvia to look at the tree that is planted for Janis and Johanna Lipke. So you can see here the tree as well as the plaque for both of them. Latvia was occupied by the Nazis in the summer of 1941, beginning with Operation Barbarossa. I mentioned this back before when we were talking about Dan Michman's definition of rescue. Now, when Latvia was occupied by the Nazis, there was actually a lot of local support for the Nazi occupation because there was a lot of thoughts that Hitler would bring independence to Latvia and stand as a bloc against the Soviet Union. And many Latvians were nervous about being incorporated into the Soviet Union. And this also created a lot of pogroms in the first days of the occupation. A lot of it was heckled on by the Nazis themselves and propaganda that they put on, which showed massive cooperation in pogroms, which was violence against the Jews in Latvia. But Janis Lipke was different, and his son, who remembers him, always remembers this one moment that he was looking into the Riga ghetto at the horrible conditions that the Jews in the ghetto faced, and crying and telling his son, "Look, son, and never forget what you see here," because what Janis Lipke believed was happening here was humanity and humans being abused. And his son always says that he was defined by this love for humanity and the ability to worry about others. Janis was, before the war, a hardworking port worker. And during the war, he was able to get a job for the German Air Force. And one of the things that he was in charge of was transporting Jews in and out of the ghetto to places of work. And he used this position to do something that he had actually done when he was a port worker, which was smuggling. And he was essentially able to smuggle Jews out of the ghetto so that they could survive outside of the ghetto. As he began to get into this, more and more efforts of rescue began to arise. He began to take Jews into his own home to save them. He began to find places of hiding amongst his neighbors in order to hide more Jews. And on top of that, he actually tried to plan an escape of lots of Jews on a yacht to get to Sweden. And this is actually, he was caught at this point. He was caught with a Jew. His name was Pearl. And Janis was actually able to bribe his way out of the situation. His friend was not as lucky and was murdered. Out of fear after the situation, he moves his entire family out of the city, but continues to hide Jews. And I just want to kind of think about this specific situation because unlike Schindler, who was in a position of authority, and unlike Trocmé, who was a leader, we have a simple man here. A simple man who doesn't just make one decision that changes everything. He makes a multitude of moral and ethical decisions to keep going, to keep trying to save Jews. Even after he's caught, he doesn't stop. He doesn't say, okay, this is a danger. He continues to hide Jews and he continues to help Jews throughout this entire time. And so this kind of moral drive of helping, as he saw it, his love for humanity and his ability to worry for others continues to drive all of his actions. And so at every moment that something happens, he has another dilemma. What do I do? And I just want us to think about it a little bit deeper because he's not only making these decisions for himself, but he has a wife and he has 3 children. So I just want to read a quote from somebody else, which for me kind of sums up how I often think about the righteous. And it's by a woman named Janis, who was herself Jewish and rescued. And I just want to read this specific quote because it just reminds me specifically of the dilemma that righteous faced. They brought me to a farmstead and sat me on a long beach. There were 4 children in the family I came to, and they took me as well. I want everyone to know the name of the woman who saved me, Olympia Posaritska, from the village of Jenvishi in the Vorozhinsk district. As long as I lived in this family, fear lived in it. They could have been shot at any moment. The whole family, including the 4 children, for harboring a Jewish child from the ghetto. I was their death. What great hearts they had to have, superhumanly human hearts. Now, I specifically brought that quote because I think it really makes you understand what it means to harbor and to hide a Jew. And so Janis, who had 3 children and a wife, every moment knew that harboring and helping Jews could bring the death not only of him, but his family. And so this is a moral decision that he makes every day. What is the worth of my actions and what is the worth of hiding people? And I think, this quote really always gets me because Janis writes, this last sentence, superhumanly human hearts. And she repeats this superhumanly human hearts. When we think of superheroes, we think of superpowers and people with capes who fly and disappear or whatever it is that they can do, and they're almost not human. But here she focuses on the word human. They were human, they were people. No matter the actions which seem to us almost superhumanly. And so there's this balance of these actions, these moral decisions that go above and beyond, which were done by humans who made these very personal and difficult choices. And I think that that's why that quote kind of hits me. And when I think specifically of Janis and what he risked during the entire time, we see, how inspiring each of his decisions was, to not just stop at one action, just to smuggle the Jews out, but to try to get them to Sweden, and then to move his family and continue to hide Jews. This action after action, this decision and this decision to continue and to go on. I want to move into the partisans. And I know that in the last tour, for those of you who were able to make it in the last tour, that partisans were spoken about, but we're going to look at partisans in a very different way. We're going to look at partisan family camps. So we're going to come back into the museum as we look a little bit closer at a Zimlanka, and we'll talk about the Zimlanka as we get a little bit more into the issue of the partisan camps. Family camps, sorry. So there are two main family camps that we can speak about. The first is Shalom Zorin, which is probably the lesser known of the two main family camps. And he was a commander of the family camp in the Naliboki forest, which was in Belarus, which was close to Minsk. And most of the Jews who arrived into his family camp were also from Minsk. And there were approximately 800 Jews in his camp, and approximately 150 of them, which were children. And the second one, which we're going to focus a little bit more on, was the Bielski brothers, who operated in Western Belarus. And many of the Jews who arrived into their camp were from Lida and Novogrodsk. And we're situated right now as I mentioned, in the Zimlanka. And the Zimlanka was a popular way that partisans in general were able to, first of all, create shelter in the forests. So you can see in the very kind of foresty area of Yad Vashem of Jerusalem, which obviously the ones in Belarus looked much different, there would have been trees everywhere, and the wooden roofs that you could see over here would have helped hide the Zimlanka, these places where they lived, and we'll kind of see into the next one. And in that sense, the actual structures were built almost under the ground, so that if you were looking from the outside, which we can come back to, and the whole goal was it to kind of blend into the landscape while still giving shelter to those people who were hiding in them, especially because, if you'll remember, we're talking about Belarus, which you can imagine the winters were incredibly cold. Now, when we talk about partisan family camps, we're talking about kind of a different category of rescue, because we're talking about Jews saving Jews. And righteous, their lives weren't, in most of the cases, weren't actually originally in danger. They chose that path to put themselves and their families in danger. And sometimes, as we saw in some of the cases we looked at, they were able to take advantage of certain positions in order to help save Jews. For example, we had Oskar Schindler, who was a businessman or a pastor in a village. But here, we're looking specifically at people whose lives were in danger themselves. And at least for me, I would think that the most natural response for my own life being in danger would be to try to save myself, and perhaps as well my family. And so I think a larger kind of question arises, is what would motivate someone who needs to save their own lives to go above and beyond that in order to try and save the lives of other Jews? And so in this way, there's almost a double risk here, right? They have to save their own lives as well as saving the lives of other people. And yet, despite this, we often see that rescue is of people that they didn't even know, which is to say that they went past their kind of family and close friends and saved people they didn't know. And this was, of course, the case for both the Zorin as well as the Bielski brothers. And this kind of idea of saving people that they didn't know reminds me of a quote attributed to Tuvia Bielski, who said, "Don't rush to fight and die. So few of us are left. We need to save lives. It is more important to save Jews than to kill Germans." And together with his brothers, the Bielski brothers, they saved approximately 1,200 Jews. So there were three brothers, Tuvia, Asiel, and Zusia, who all grew up in East Poland in the village of Stanilewicz. And when they were put into the ghetto in 1941, there was mass murders right at the beginning with the occupation by the Nazis. And in December 1941, their parents were murdered, as well as some of their wives. And so they decided to escape and leave to the forest. These were forests near their homes, which they were familiar with and felt comfortable going into. And so I guess the first kind of moral dilemma that they would have to ask themselves is, what is our goal? You know, we've come to the forest. What do we want to do? We want to create a partisan unit. Well, what kind of partisan unit do we want to create? Do we want to fight? Or do we want to save Jews? And it was decided, and Tuvia said himself, that he would rather save one old Jewish woman than kill 10 German soldiers. And so there was this idea here of kind of national unity and the continuation of the Jewish people that pushed them and motivated them to choose the response of, let's not, exact revenge, and let's not only put our efforts into killing Nazis, but to save Jews. So we already have that first dilemma of what our goal is. And the second one comes from who will be arriving at this family camp. Because it's not enough to just, if your goal is to save Jews, then it's not enough to rely on those Jews who will be able to get to you. Because of course we have dilemmas for those people inside of the ghettos of leaving the ghetto and coming into the forest. We know, for example, even in the Mir ghetto, where they were told about the day of execution, only 200 people and 500 people stayed in the ghetto. Only 200 people fled into the forest looking for partisan groups. So what would make so many people stay in the ghetto, knowing in this specific instance of the Mir ghetto that they would be killed? And the answer is, how can I leave? Because imagine who people are. If you're a mother with children, if you're elderly, if you're young and you don't have your parents, if you're scared, the Bielski brothers, they moved often. And so they weren't, in one space. No one gave you a map. Okay, go this way, turn left, and then you get to the partisan unit. And so how can you get there? If it's winter, how can I survive? How can I leave? Can I leave my family? And so there's so many dilemmas, personal dilemmas of how do I even get out of this ghetto? And so in that sense, the Bielski brothers decided to send scouts. They decided to send fighters to ghettos in order to convince people to come, and they would act as their guide to get to the family camps. But this, of course, proved to be another moral dilemma, because what began to be happening is that the Nazis would ensure that there was a certain number of people in the ghettos, especially when those ghettos became much more working. They wanted to ensure that nobody left the ghettos. And if there were missing Jews, there would be reprisal killings. And so we have another decision here. Do we take out 10 Jews who are willing to come with us into our camp? And how many Jews will the Nazis murder in revenge for us taking out those Jews? And so do we have a moral obligation to not take anyone out because we might be responsible for the deaths of others? And in fact, we know that the Judenrat, the Jewish councils, the Jewish leaders in so many of these ghettos actually didn't want Jews to leave and encouraged them not to leave, so that they could, they were afraid that there would be all these reprisal killings. And so we have a very big kind of moral dilemma of, is it worth it to save some lives if it's going to cost others? And also one other thing is that when those ghettos began to be working, many people in the ghetto would have trusted into the Nazi system. Well, I'm needed, I'm a worker. And they, perhaps they didn't know if they would be killed later on or not. In the Mir ghetto, which I mentioned before, I think this is a unique circumstance when they knew that there was death and only 200 left. And so many of the other ghettos, they didn't know their future. And so why do you take a chance to leave when you don't know? What about food and supplies? How do you get that? Of course, there were some peasants who were willing to help, but oftentimes in these forests, they were also providing food as well as resources for German soldiers. And so they might not have enough, even if they wanted to support partisans in the forest fighting the Nazis, they might not have had enough. to support both partisans as well as Germans. And then, of course, you have the people who wouldn't have wanted to support partisans because they would have been fearful of their own lives if the Germans caught them cooperating with the Nazis. And I just want to read you a quote of one partisan from the Bielski camp who remembers this moral dilemma of how can we just go and take food? He writes, a partisan was something between a hero and a robber. We had to live, and we had to deprive the peasants of their meager belongings. Those natives were punished by the Germans and by us. At least if they were all pro-German, it would have been easier. This usually was not the case. Often we took by force from poor peasants who were not even pro-Nazi. So you're taking people who are on your side, who don't have to give with you. And of course, that's, a huge moral dilemma of how can you hurt someone else? He calls himself a robber as well as a partisan. The next moral decision they would have had to have talked about was how many more people can they or should they take inside of their unit? And should we only take fighters, or should we continue to take children and elderly? Do we turn people away because we have too many? And would we be more likely to be discovered if we took more people in? Because we would need more supplies, we'd need to take more, we would be harder to move from place to place. And so should we stop the number and turn people away? Right. And coming back to that first quote that I talked about with Tuvia, I would rather, save one Jewish woman rather than kill 10 Nazis. And as well, the other quote I mentioned from him, which was that his goal was to save Jews rather than to do anything else. And so he made the decision, Tuvia, to accept more Jews, despite many moral obligations that came from the people already in the partisan unit. And this brings me to the next the next moral decision is what rules need to be implemented and who gets to kind of control and make all of these rules. Like, do we have a vote? Is there a democratic process? And in the end, we know that Tuvia became essentially the leader or the commander of the entire unit. And so his word was what happened. And so even though there were moral objections to so many of the ideas that I just brought up, he was the one who made the final decision above and beyond anyone else. One of the other moral questions is, of course, who has more privileges and who gets more food? So children and elderly, or fighters? Now, in theory, everybody was entitled to have 3 meals a day. But what would happen actually in practice was those people who were soldiers and guards of the actual unit themselves, they were the ones who really made a decision and were able to kind of get priority and get much more privileges and food. And also there's a lot of more moral dilemmas. I'm just going to bring up a few quickly because I think that our time is running out. Who can fight? Who makes a decision who can fight? Women were not allowed to fight in the Bielski family camp, even though they wanted to. And what happens when people wanted or needed more? There's the story of Shmuel Gebler, who stole milk, and the milk was actually only allowed they had cows. It was only allowed for children. And he makes the decision one day that he just can't take it anymore, and he steals milk, and he's punished. He's put in jail. So they have an entire system here. So is it fair that we can, punish people who are helping, who are fighters because of this need? And so looking at the family camp, I think, how do they get food? How do they make their rules? How do they fight? All of these bring up at every stage different moral and ethical dilemmas that we came through. As our time is coming to a close now, I just wanted to make a conclusion, which is that rescue itself, and whether it's looking at the righteous amongst the nations, or whether it's looking at the partisan camps, which was Jews saving Jews, each of these cases takes an immense amount of courage, kindness, and humanity. And in many ways, a sense or some kind of guide of morality, which helped guide each of their decisions. And in many cases, especially in our position today, we do not have exactly the ability to say if these decisions were right or they're not right. because we are not in that specific situation. And we also today have the ability to retrospectively look back and see maybe they did make the right decision, when in that moment it could have been almost an impossible one. So I'd like to open it up now for questions.
Hailey, firstly, I'd like to thank you very much for a very engaging and thought-provoking virtual tour of Yad Vashem. You've really got me thinking, and I'm sure everyone else here. And again, I'd also like to thank you on behalf of the US desk. So I do have a few questions. The first one is, are there any books you can recommend on the ethics and dilemmas during the Holocaust?
Are there any, pardon?
Are there any books you can recommend?
Any books? I definitely, Dan Michman, who I mentioned at the beginning, wrote a book, Hiding and Sheltering Jews. And in it are lots of different cases of rescue, including Jews, Jews hiding Jews, as well as righteous amongst the nation. And he looks at ethical dilemmas, and he brings in all different types of historians.
Thank you. Also, what other types of partisans other than family camps did Jews join?
Right, so there would have been basically 3 different types of partisan groups which were created. The first one, which was the family camps that we looked at. The second group of partisans would have been Jewish only partisan groups. And the biggest example we have of this is outside of Vilna. They were called the Avengers, and they were led, Abba Kovner, for anyone who is familiar with him, would have been one of the kind of leading partisans in that group. And they were all Jewish. And unlike the Bielski brothers, which I mentioned, didn't allow women to fight, they actually had women fighting. So I think, just coming off of International Women's Day, we see many strong fighters who fought in these partisan groups, which is really amazing. And then the last group would have been the Russian partisans. So in 1941, with the beginning of the occupation of the Soviet Union, Stalin gave an order for partisan units to be created. So they kind of came under a central organizations, and Jews were welcome to join those units. Some of them came defecting from the Soviet Union, some of them escaped from ghettos, but these wouldn't have been specifically Jewish partisan units. They would have been just kind of larger partisan units that Jews would have joined along with Russians. And one thing that's kind of interesting to note is that we now have many cases of anti-Semitism that was reported within these groups, even though the Soviet Union's ideology was kind of this equality between people and the erasing of nations, that a lot of people felt more comfortable in the Jewish partisan groups.
All right, I just had a question come through now. Is Yad Vashem now making investigations to discover new righteous of the nations? And did anyone get the title in the last few years?
Yes, and yes, to both of those. I think that there's approximately 600 nominations each year. And there are approximately 100 people each year who are given the title of Righteous Amongst the Nation. And this committee that I mentioned at the beginning is still very real and still debates many different cases. The biggest challenge that we have today is that one of the conditions to be a righteous is to have survivor testimony. And of course, we're entering an age where we are losing survivors, unfortunately, because of the year and their age. And so we don't have that testimony. And so in terms of the documentation, it's becoming harder and harder to be able to actually prove a lot of these cases. And we know that it's only actually in exceptional cases where we look at primary documents in order to prove it. So the committee is continuing, and more people are being nominated each year. And even after they've passed away, they're still being nominated.
Okay, thank you. We still have time for a few more questions. I've got one here. Is there a significance as to why Yad Vashem basically chose to plant trees on the Yad Vashem campus to recognize the righteous among the nations?
So the trees, I think, first of all, they're all fruit-bearing trees. So the most popular were the ones that we saw were all carob trees, which I think is interesting because it shows us the power of what trees give and what trees continue to give. So when we look at a tree, We can think about what its significance is in our world, whether it's the fruits or the oxygen or the beauty that it gives. It continues to provide every day. And, you know, in 30, 40, 50 years, no matter when you come back to Yad Vashem, and no matter how much the landscape changes, you know, the trees are there and they continue to grow. And so we can ask the question, what does it mean to save one life? Well, you know, we don't just have that life of that one person. I think I mentioned it when I talked about Oskar Schindler, you know, the generations that came afterwards. And one of the beautiful scenes in Schindler's List is actually the true scene, the one kind of real scene, which is the very end, when the survivors, as well as their children and grandchildren, come to his grave, which is in Jerusalem, to place a rock on it, and you see the generations of people that survived. And so it reminds us, you know, we don't just give one life, we give much more than that. We give generations and the impact of people to the world.
And I think we have time for one more question. We've had one come through now, which is, how does Yad Vashem categorize rescuers in democracies who are not risking their own lives? Okay,
so that's actually a great question. And it doesn't matter the original country that they were coming from, it matters where they were. So Nicholas Winston saved Jews. First of all, he's Jewish himself, I'm pretty sure, so he wouldn't be allowed to be a righteous amongst the nation. But it doesn't matter where they're from, it matters where they are during the war. So for example, we know that there is an American soldier who was nominated because he tried to save Jewish lives after being caught by the Nazis. And so it doesn't matter, Yad Vashem doesn't categorize rescuers by the countries they're originally from, but only where they were during the time of the war. And they need to fit the criteria of their own life being in danger by the action that they did. And so if somebody from the United States tried to save somebody who was Jewish during that time, it wouldn't count as righteous. Even though an American who was in somewhere in occupied territory risked their life, they would be nominated.
Thank you. I think that was Roddy Edmonds. Is that correct? The sergeant you were talking about?
Exactly. That is correct. Yeah.
Right. And I think, yeah, we have time for one more question, because one has come through, which is actually a very interesting question. What about Jews who saved other Jews? Do they get any titles or awards?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that also opens an entire Pandora box, which the Israeli government tried to open a few years ago. And I think, you know, I asked some of those kind of questions before, which I'll kind of come back on, how they don't, first of all, just to say, basically, they don't have any awards or titles. Their stories are told. Their stories are told in the museum, on the campus, on Yad Vashem's website. There's a whole exhibition, an online exhibition on Yad Vashem's website, Jews Saving Jews. On Yom HaShoah last year, the main title and theme was Jews Saving Jews. So they are honored and talked about, but they don't have an official award or title like the Righteous Amongst the Nation do. And I think that there's a lot of Pandora's box of opening, because then, you know, what does it mean for a Jew to save a Jew's life? Like I said, you know, giving a piece of bread in the ghetto. If I save my husband's life, is that counting? And so it's very difficult to define this, but all the kind of bigger stories are talked about, but there's no specific award.
Hailey, thank you so much again. It really has given us a lot of food for thought. And with this, we'll conclude the lecture. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.